Chapter 12 of A Very Private Public Citizen, The Life of Grenville Clark. Resisting cold warriors, writing for peace and defending academic freedom. While recalibrating his peace strategy, Clark had a health scare that kept him close to home, at least for a while. In February 1947, he was turned down for a health insurance policy after a routine physical turned up an intermittent heart murmur. The news led to a thorough cardiac review, which also revealed some irregular heartbeats, mild to moderate hypertension, and other symptoms now commonly associated with Clark's hard-driving Type A personality. Clark didn't panic, but ever precise, queried his doctor and friend Paul Dudley White, the renowned cardiologist at Massachusetts General Hospital, about finding just the right activity level. My general philosophy is that, on one hand, I don't want to wrap myself up in cotton wool, avoid all activity, etc., to an extreme extent, just for the sake of breathing a few years longer than otherwise. But on the other hand, I am desirous of not smashing up and going out prematurely and unnecessarily, so to speak, because of failure to take every reasonable precaution. As always, Clark's motives involve duty. The reasons are A, that my life is happy and satisfactory, and B, that I can be of some use to my wife and children, and C, that I have work to do in the shape of some systemic writing that I would like to be completed and which at a slow pace would require several years. Moving on to specifics, he proposed a plan. How about mild exercise in the country? Short walks, mild canoe paddling, a little swimming, and riding an old pony. Is this okay, or is it better to confine activity to the minimum? Between Dr. White's good advice and Fanny's hawk-like care, Clark would walk the line between cotton wool and smashing up for nearly 2 more decades. He temporarily moderated his peace efforts and dutifully served most of his professional obligations except for the Harvard Corporation. The pull of citizen action did at times prove irresistible, as when Clark organized his neighbors to protest the planned installation of an ungainly FM radio tower on his beloved Mount Monadnock. The communications officials were surely given a lesson in the power of an activated citizenry, and the tower was never built, but at least he was beginning to find some balance. The systemic writing Clark mentioned to Paul White, of course, meant formalizing his ideas about world peace through world law. That would eventually happen, and it would take much longer than several years, but for the time being, Dr. White and Fanny encouraged their patient to take a break from that all-consuming topic and consider writing a memoir. Why not tell the remarkable story of his recent Washington years? Clark was intrigued and updated Charles Burlingham on the new plan in September 1947. Dear Cece, we've settled down in Dublin nearly 8 months of the year. It suits Fanny, and she is occupied every minute with the little farm, and it suits me very well with my office and work, and to the Harvard Corporation duties on the side. It is quite convenient to go to meetings from here, only a 2-hour trip. I still work away on the subject of world peace, but simultaneously, for the last few months, I have been working up notes for a memoir of my own to really cover the 9 years, 1939 to 1947. I want to give a really correct and documented account of the initiation of the passage of the Selective Service Act and the appointment of Stimson and Patterson, both in 1940, various things of interest in the War Department, and outside it that I worked on, etc. I have an office here with my books and papers and have had an excellent young assistant from the Harvard Graduate School for the summer months. The excellent young assistant Clark mentioned was Samuel S. Spencer Jr., who would serve for many years as president of Davidson College in North Carolina. In 1947, Spencer was a doctoral student in Harvard's history department. After having served in World War II, when Clark inquired for a student to help him write his memoir, Spencer's name came up. The young man did not know Mr. Clark, but agreed to meet him at the Hotel Vendome in Boston to discuss the project. There, he learned that Clark's doctors had advised him that he could not keep up his hard-driving life, that he had heart trouble, and that he needed to take it easy. Perhaps it was a good time to write his memoirs. Clark may have been taking a page from Henry Stimson, who had recently entered into a similar arrangement with McGeorge Bundy to write his own memoir on active service in peace and war. Stimson was enthusiastic about Clark's following suit. You certainly should record your work. At almost every critical period in our history, which I can remember, it was your sagacity which diagnosed and pushed forward the best remedy, and you have not had a quarter of the recognition for which you should have. Stimson's letter was one of the very few that Clark deliberately served, saying he'd rather have it than half a dozen medals. Clark proposed they begin with the recent Selective Service Act campaign and the ensuring War Department years. It was a meaty and interesting story. Spencer agreed and got right to work. He spent the next 2 summers in Dublin, where Clark had turned his barn into a quasi-office storehouse with office furniture and equipment shipped up from New York, along with towering stacks of boxes, files, records, books, and the like. But despite Stimson's urgings, Clark's good intentions, and Sam Spencer's able assistance, the memoir project was doomed from the start. It quickly became clear to Spencer that Clark's involvement would be limited at best. Every time the young man arrived at Outlet Farm, Clark was busy meeting with individuals or groups about world peace, the United Nations, Harvard, or some other major project. Spencer soon realized he was really serving as the older man's cover for his wife and doctors. Clark could truthfully say he was working on his memoirs without actually disrupting his other activities. This was no deliberate plan of deception, which would not have been in Clark's character. Rather, it was that Grenville Clark, then 65, was incapable of living largely in the past, while there was important work to be done in the present. At the end of the second summer, Spencer approached his boss directly. "Mr. Clark, you know you're not going to finish this memoir project. In fact, you're not even going to finish this selective service campaign, part of it. Would you mind if I take the research I've done so far and use it for my doctoral dissertation?" Clark happily agreed, undoubtedly much relieved. Spencer went back to Cambridge, finished his dissertation, got his PhD, married his longtime sweetheart, Ava. The engagement ring came from a Boston jeweler recommended by a twinkling Clark, and struck out on his own impressive career. The 2 men remained in warm contact throughout Clark's life. Later, Spencer served as a founding member of the board of the Grenville Clark Fund, established at Dartmouth College after Clark died. With the memoir alibi removed, Clark tried again to be semi-retired. He spent extra time with Fanny and did some directed puttering around Outlet Farm. In fact, the Wall Street lawyer and Washington agitator sounds every bit the gentleman farmer, if no less meticulous, in a delightfully domesticated letter to his younger daughter. "Dear Louisa, it has quit raining and is lovely weather. The garden is behind and we shall be late starting haying because of the wet, but the hay is amazingly high and thick. We are having a big time with the milk to get the bacteria count down. It is too high, apparently due to slow cooling in the refrigerator. Even though it gets very cold in there, it apparently does it too slowly, being put in a 20-quart can. It needs to be put soon after being milked into cold water. So we are embarked on having a 4-jug cooler in the barn cellar. We are negotiating for a second-hand one owned by a man nearby, Antrim. We are learning quite a lot. In other news, Mr. Mayor got a big fish, probably 3 pounds, out of the water, but it broke the hook and got away. While Clark was sending his daughter local farm and fishing reports, he was also paying close attention to national and world events. Throughout 1947, Clark had been filling notebooks with observations of the perplexing course of American foreign policy. There was much to observe that year, with the architecture of the Cold War rapidly changing the U.S. foreign policy landscape. The Truman Doctrine was announced in March, specifically to provide aid to Greece and Turkey during the Greek Civil War. Although the underlying purpose of the doctrine clearly was to counter Stalin's increasing subordination of Eastern Europe and fears of the spread of communism around the globe. In June came the Marshall Plan, the massive rebuilding and relief effort to aid war-ravaged Europe. Clark was alarmed that both major international initiatives were conceived completely outside the United Nations, despite their enormous implications for member nations. Also in March came Truman's loyalty order, which instituted mandatory loyalty oaths for federal employees and limited freedoms of press and assembly. In September, the National Security Act created the modern Department of Defense, Army, Navy, and Air Force, along with the brand new Central Intelligence Agency. To many observers, including Clark, it all added up to the U.S. government's putting itself on a new institutional footing for renewed total war. Clark never stopped pressing for amendments to the United Nations Charter, working through friends both inside and outside the United Nations. He drafted two resolutions calling for charter review that were introduced in the United Nations General Assembly by the Cuban delegation. Argentina later introduced another resolution Clark wrote on a related topic. Clark also worked behind the scenes through the Washington columnist and foreign policy commentator Edgar Ansel Maurer to try to bring the regulation of atomic energy under United Nations control. While none of these initiatives passed, each provoked vigorous debate, and for Clark, the public conversation education component was nearly as important as the final outcome. All while Clark's circle of reform-minded men and women continued to expand. In February 1948, Clark made a major address on United Nations reform to the New York City Bar Association. He was on his old home turf and speaking to a friendly audience, even if most of the attorneys were much more conservative than he on the topic of world law. Clark argued eloquently and persuasively that the root cause of war was anarchy among nations, absent an official international structure, and that the American containment policy outlined in the Truman Doctrine only made things worse, reinforcing the age-old us versus them mentality that he could only provoke a similar or worse reaction from the Russians. He proposed a series of United Nations Charter amendments with concessions by both the Americans and the Soviets. Clark received a warm reception, but any hope of influencing policy was extinguished 3 weeks later with the communist takeover of Czechoslovakia. The Cold War loomed ever larger. and containing communism was foremost on the minds, lips, and policy pens of elected officials in both parties. Nevertheless, Clark sent out printed copies of his New York speech along with a cover letter to friends, colleagues, and high-ranking United Nations and U.S. government officials. He included President Truman on his distribution list and quickly hit a brick wall, despite having enjoyed cordial personal relationships with U.S. presidents from Theodore Roosevelt to Franklin Roosevelt and most in between. Clark never managed to establish a rapport with FDR's immediate successor. The chasm between the two men's upbringings, influences, and outlook was bigger than either man's apparent need or willingness to bridge it. Clark's major premise in the speech, that the United States should negotiate more closely and in better faith with the Soviet Union, was underscored in his cover letter. The truth is that in containing Russia, we have gone a long way in imitating Russian ideas in respect to coerced conformity. We had better look this straight in the eye and realize that this result is just as adverse a consequence as deficits and trade restrictions. Truman, who considered himself a historian, responded testily, "I don't know what people expect from governments represented by Molotov, Vyshinsky, and Gromyko. They have fixed ideas, and these ideas were set out by Peter the Great in his will." The president was referring to a document, supposedly the infamous Tsar will, that expressly states the Russians' goal of world domination. But Clark himself was no slouch when it came to history. He knew he had top Russian experts at Harvard reconfirm that the sensational will of Peter the Great was in fact an inauthentic propaganda piece well on its way to becoming urban legend. Clark fired off a distinctly imperial telegram to the White House, effectively ending the conversation. "You were greatly imposed upon in being led to believe the authenticity of the so-called will of Peter the Great. It was publicized for propaganda purposes shortly before Napoleon's invasion of Russia, and is apparently being used for similar purposes now." Even without the testy exchange about Peter the Great's will, a close association between Clark and Truman would have been unlikely. The vast differences between them in many ways mirrored those between Truman and his predecessor, Franklin Roosevelt. Elite New England upbringing versus Missouri hill farmer. Ivy League education versus no formal college degree. Wall Street lawyer versus Kansas City herbsheater, and so many more. The plain-spoken president from the show-me state would surely have received coolly any advice from the Harvard Brahmin about negotiating with the Russians or about virtually any other topic. More puzzling was the dearth of communication between Clark and Truman's successor, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower was a summarily liberal-minded conservative with a military background who later became a vocal advocate for peace. At a glance, he and Clark would seem natural allies. Some of Eisenhower's public statements on the world peace, disarmament, and international law sound as if ghost-written by Clark. Since the advent of nuclear weapons, it seems clear that there is no longer any alternative to peace. If there is to be a happy and well world, there can be no true disarmament without peace, and there can be no real peace without very material disarmament. The peace we seek and need means much more than mere absence of war. It means the acceptance of law and the fostering of justice in all the world and many more. Yet all that exists on record between the two men and is one stilted exchange in which Eisenhower offers a somewhat garbled reply as to whether he has read Clark's 1950 book, A Plan for Peace. Clark's slim, cogent summary of the underlying world problem as he saw it, international anarchy in a nuclear age. The president does address his and Clark's shared concern about the difficulties inherent in sacrosanct notions of national sovereignty, but beyond that, a clear message is hard to decipher. Secretary Dulles and I and others have discussed this matter frequently, and by coincidence, only within the last few days. Now I have not read this particular book, although I have read much of what Grenville Clark has written, and I have no doubt that it is on the same vein reality, a world of peace through world law. I myself, quoting my favorite author, wrote a short chapter to conclude a book that I wrote back in 1947 or 48, and in it I pointed out that there was going to be no peace. There was going to be no real strength among the free world countries unless each was willing to examine its simple sole sovereign position and to see whether it could make some concessions, each to the others, that it could make a legal or law basis for settling disputes. Now I think that is the gist of Mr. Clark's, and as a matter of fact, Justice Roberts was of the same group. It was the kernel of his thinking. Eisenhower. Not a particularly illuminating response, let alone an eloquent endorsement. There is no record the two men attempted to communicate again. It is hard to guess how the president, on whom Clark arguably had the most influence, Franklin Roosevelt, would have felt about Clark's peace proposals. Clark was convinced FDR would have been a strong supporter had he lived to see the Cold War and nuclear arms race develop. A reporter asked Clark near the end of his life whether Roosevelt have supported world peace through world law, belatedly making good on his own great objective to keep the peace. Yes, I believe he would have, Clark answered, although he was not ready in 1944 to sponsor the truly revolutionary changes that were required to constitute an effective United Nations. I firmly believe that today, 1966, he would have perceived the absolute necessity for total disarmament under effective world law. He would have gone for it in a bold and determined way. Clark wanted to think every head of state could be persuaded to the logic of world peace through world law once they fully understood it. In 1949, the instigation of repressive Cold War-era policies and tactics was bold, determined, and had academic freedom in its crosshairs. Harold Dodds, the president of Princeton, described academic freedom as, at best, a unique sort of freedom difficult for many laymen to comprehend, and noted that it was undergoing its periodic hostile scrutiny. These tactics were reminiscent of the teacher loyalty oath campaign Clark had battled in the 1930s, except this time scrutiny came from a different source. The teacher oaths had been largely the work of state legislatures, but now wealthy conservative alumni were protesting against professors at their alma maters who were seen as in many ways red or sympathetic to communism. Against this backdrop, Grenville Clark became a considerable celebrity in academic circles for his resounding response to one such protester, an angry right-wing Harvard Law School alumnus named Frank Ober. Ober was a rabid anti-communist and the author of a Maryland anti-subversion statute that bore his name. He threatened to withhold a large pledge contribution to the university unless Harvard disciplined certain faculty or fired for them their left-leaning political views. Harvard President James B. Conant immediately turned to Grenville Clark for assistance. He wrote to Clark, "Ordinarily, I do not trouble the members of the corporation with my fan mail. In this case, however, I was wondering if you would not take care to Mr. Ober on." In an essay published in 1975, Conant recounted, "I turned to Grenville Clark for assistance. I knew no one could write a better defense of Harvard's position. Clark agreed, relishing the opportunity to defend both his alma mater and academic freedom as a foundational American liberty. He later called the Ober incident by far the most significant matter in which I had a part. The reaffirmation in 1949 of the university's adherence to its traditional refusal to police or discipline its faculty for unpopular views. Clark's response to Ober was a 12-page, single-spaced tour de force, part legal brief, part history lesson on Harvard, part ringing treatise on civil liberties. His epic communique began. Dear Mr. Ober, Mr. Conan asked me to write you regarding the history and significance of the traditional Harvard policy on freedom of expression for the faculties and students. I am willing to do this because I think your letter raises questions that go to the very life of Harvard and all other colleges that are, therefore, of vital consequence to the contrary at large. Let me say at once that your proposals apparently to dismiss or censor two professors and certainly to impose drastic controls on the activities as citizens of all professors cannot and will not be adopted at Harvard, so long as Harvard remains true to her principles. To clarify those principles, Clark quoted from the 1869 inaugural address of his esteemed mentor, former Harvard President Charles W. Eliot. A university must be indigenous. It must be rich, but above all, it must be free. The winnowing breeze of freedom must blow through its chambers. This university aspires to serve the nation by training men to intellectual honesty and independence of mind. The corporation demands of all its teachers that they be grave, reverent, high-minded, but it leaves them, like their pupils, free. Clark then summarized Ober's specific complaints, namely that the Harvard professor, John Ciardi, had spoken at a Progressive Party meeting in Maryland held to protest Ober's anti-communist bill, and that another professor, Harlow Shapley, had taken part in a recent World Peace Conference in New York that Ober considered subversive. Clark pointed out that both the Maryland and New York meetings were on public issues and were open to the press, and continued, "You do not question the complete legality of either meeting, and yet you seem to say that the two professors committed some sort of grave offense. I do not see how you can expect reasonable men to think of participation in open and legal meetings on public subjects as the equivalent of secret plotting to commit crime, merely because communists or fellow travelers take part in such meetings. On this line of reasoning, literally thousands of reputable citizens would have offended. By no possibility could have Harvard adopt a view which, to put it mildly, is so extreme. I believe that academic freedom is a especially vital segment of all constitutional freedoms because it concerns the students as much as the professors. If the professors are censored, constrained, or harassed, it affects not only themselves, it affects also those whom they teach. The future voters and leaders upon whose integrity and independence of mind will depend the institutions by which we live and breathe a free air. For if the professors have always to conform and avoid unpopular views, whether in class or not, what kind of men will they be? And where will our young men and women go to hear and weigh new ideas to consider both sides and acquire balance and integrity? Clark wrapped up his arguments by acknowledging that Ober would probably not find them convincing, at least not yet. I am under no illusion that this letter or any similar argument is likely to affect your attitude in this matter, at least for some time. For my observation in the corresponding period after the First World War was in a period of alarm. Proposals to restrict free expression rest on strong feelings, which for the time override sound judgment. I hope, though, that I may have convinced you that there is another side, and that there is a deep-rooted tradition at Harvard utterly opposed to your view, a tradition that must and will be upheld as long as Harvard remains true to herself. Grenville Clark. While Ober likely was not persuaded, Clark hit a home run for academic freedom. He had also won from all practical standpoints. Professors Ciardi and Shapley were not censored. Harvard's integrity was not compromised, and Clark's letter may stand as the classic defense of the rights of professors everywhere to freely express their views, even and perhaps especially when those views are outside the prevailing political mainstream.